Your project deadline is wrong. Not because you slacked off, not because your team is lazy, but because your brain, right now, at this very moment, is doing exactly what it evolved to do, and that thing happens to sabotage timelines every single time. Psychologists call it the planning fallacy. It is the tendency to underestimate how long something will take, even when you have a mountain of past evidence proving yourself wrong. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Knowing about it does not fix it. The term comes from Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who spent his career mapping the strange shortcuts your mind takes when it thinks it is being rational. Kahneman did not discover the planning fallacy in a lab with strangers. He discovered it while living inside it. He was part of a team writing a textbook on judgment and decision-making, which is more than a little ironic given what happened next. Early in the project, he asked everyone on the team, independently, how long they thought the whole thing would take. The estimates clustered around a year, maybe a year and a half. Then he asked one more question. Think of other teams that have tried to do something like this before. How long did those projects actually take? And how many of them finished at all? The most experienced person in the room quietly admitted that similar teams typically took years longer than planned, and some never finished. The book Kahneman's team was working on ended up taking about 8 years. Everyone in that room had access to the same historical pattern before they made their guess. They still guessed a year. That is the part worth sitting with. This was not a story about people who did not know better. These were experts in the exact field of judgment and decision-making, who had the base rate sitting in front of them and used it as a sanity check, then reverted straight back to the optimistic number anyway, knowing the pattern did not neutralize it. That tells you the planning fallacy is not a knowledge problem. It is not something you fix by reading an article about it, ironically including this one. It is a structural feature of how planning brains work. So why does this happen? The core reason is that when you plan, you do not actually picture the process. You picture the outcome. Close your eyes and imagine finishing a project. You see the deliverable, the launch, the handshake, the applause. What you do not naturally picture is the 11-message thread about a font choice, the teammate who gets sick during the exact week you needed them most, the client who casually mentions one small addition that quietly triples the scope, the vendor who goes quiet for 4 days, the dependency nobody documented that only surfaces once you are halfway through. None of that shows up in the mental movie, because none of it is memorable in the way a finished product is memorable. Your brain builds the plan out of the destination, not the road, and every road has its own potholes. There is a second layer underneath that. Even when people remember that their past projects ran late, they treat the new project as a fresh start, disconnected from the pattern. This time the team is stronger. This time the client is easier. This time everyone has learned their lesson. That belief feels true in the moment, and it is almost always false, because the friction that eats timelines is not really about this specific project or this specific team. It is closer to a near universal tax on any complex work involving more than one person, one decision, or one dependency outside your direct control. The tax rate barely changes across projects. Only the story you tell yourself about why this time is different changes. You can see this play out at a scale far beyond an office project plan. Take the Sydney Opera House. Budgeted at $7 million. Everyone involved, architects, engineers, the government commissioning it, genuinely believed that number because they were picturing the finished building, not the roof engineering problems that had not been solved yet, the construction techniques that had to be invented from scratch to make the design physically possible, or the funding fights that stretched the schedule further. The final cost came in north of $100 million. That is not a rounding error. That is an estimate off by more than 14 times, produced by capable, credentialed professionals. Or take Denver International Airport's automated baggage system, projected at about 2 years. It ended up taking roughly 6. Again, not because the engineers were incompetent, but because the system turned out to be genuinely more complex than anyone modeling the schedule had accounted for. And every unexpected technical snag added weeks nobody had budgeted, because nobody budgets for a problem they have not imagined yet. That is the trap in one sentence. You cannot put a specific unknown problem on a timeline, So your timeline quietly assumes no unknown problems will occur, which is another way of saying it assumes something that has never once been true of any real project at meaningful scale. There is also a quieter incentive at work that rarely gets named out loud. An optimistic timeline is simply easier to sell. It is easier to get budget approved when the number looks lean. It is easier to keep a team's morale up at the kickoff meeting when the finish line looks close. Nobody stands up in a planning meeting and says, "Let's assume the worst case," because that person tends to get labeled as negative or as someone who is not a team player, even when they are the only one in the room doing accurate math. So the incentives inside most organizations quietly reward the confident wrong number over the cautious right one, at least until the deadline actually arrives and the bill comes due. That is not a psychology problem anymore. That is a culture problem sitting on top of a psychology problem. And it is worth noticing that the two reinforce each other. The individual bias toward optimism gets amplified by a room full of people who all have a professional incentive to agree with the optimistic number, rather than be the one who slows things down. There is also a compounding effect that makes the planning fallacy worse on bigger projects, and it has nothing to do with anyone's individual judgment. Think about a project with 10 sequential steps, each one dependent on the last. If each step has even a modest chance of running late, the odds that the entire chain finishes on time are much lower than the odds for any single step, because a delay anywhere in the chain becomes a delay for the whole thing. A single freelancer estimating a single deliverable might be off by a manageable margin. A cross-functional project involving 5 teams, 3 approval layers, and 1 external vendor is not 5 times riskier. It behaves more like it is compounding because every additional handoff is another place where a delay can enter the system and nobody downstream can fully absorb it. This is part of why the biggest, most visible failures, the opera houses, the airports, the giant enterprise software rollouts, tend to miss their targets by the widest margins. It is not that big projects attract worse planners. It is that big projects have more joints where the plan can bend. Think about how differently this same bias shows up in something as mundane as checking a map before you leave the house. The app tells you the drive will take 22 minutes based on current traffic. You know, from lived experience, that construction shows up, lights turn red at the worst possible moment, and a truck occasionally blocks a lane for no visible reason. And yet, almost everyone still leaves the house, as if 22 minutes were a hard guarantee rather than a rough median. Multiply that same instinct across a 6-month project with 40 moving pieces and dozens of people, each one running their own private version of the 22-minute assumption, and you start to see why the gap between the promised date and the real date tends to grow rather than shrink as complexity increases. Here is a thought that might reframe this for you. The planning fallacy is not really a failure of intelligence. It behaves more like an optical illusion. You can know, with total intellectual certainty, that 2 lines in a famous illusion are the same length, and your eyes will still tell you one is longer every single time you look. Telling yourself you know it is an illusion does not change what you see. The fix for an optical illusion is not willpower. It is a ruler. You stop trusting your eyes and you measure instead. The planning fallacy works the same way, and that is exactly where the fix comes from. Not stronger discipline, a different tool entirely. But here is the part nobody expects when they first hear about reference class forecasting, which is the actual name for that ruler. It flips the entire question you ask when you plan. Instead of asking, "How long will this take?" which invites your brain straight back into the rosy inside view story, you ask, "How long did similar projects actually take?" Not this project, not your team specifically, the whole class of project this belongs to. If you are launching a product, look at the last several product launches at your company, not the plan for this one. If you are building an internal tool, look at how long the last few internal tools genuinely took from kickoff to shipped, not from kickoff to the date someone declared it done on a slide. That single reframing, from the inside view to the outside view, is one of the most reliable debiasing habits researchers have identified, and it consistently beats gut feel estimates from the people closest to the work. This is exactly why bringing in someone outside the project to give an estimate is so disproportionately effective. It is not that outsiders are smarter or more experienced. It is that they have no emotional investment in the optimistic story. They did not spend 6 weeks building excitement around this launch. They do not need this deadline to feel achievable in order to stay motivated. They are not picturing the finished product with the same vividness you are, so they default to the boring statistical question, what usually happens with things like this. That boring question is exactly the one your inside view is structurally incapable of asking with a straight face, because asking it honestly would mean admitting the exciting story you have been telling your team might not hold up. Here is where this should change how you actually run your next planning meeting, because this is where the value in understanding the planning fallacy really lives. Not in the psychology trivia, but in the operational habit you build around it. Stop asking your team, how long will this take? Ask directly. That question reliably produces the optimistic story answer, because it invites people to imagine smooth execution from the very first word. Instead, ask 2 separate questions and treat them as genuinely different exercises. First, think of the last 2 or 3 projects that were structurally similar to this one. Not identical, just similar in shape, similar in the number of people and dependencies involved. How long did those actually take, start to finish, including every delay? Write that number down before anyone talks about the current project specifically. Second, only after that reference number is on the table, talk about what is different this time. You will notice something interesting happens. The conversation about what is different tends to surface real, specific risks. The vendor relationship that is shaky. The teammate who is part-time this quarter, rather than vague optimism. That is because you anchored the discussion to reality first. And reality is a far better foundation for adjustment than a fantasy is. There is a companion habit worth pairing with reference class forecasting, and it works from the opposite direction. Instead of only asking how long similar projects took in the past, have the team imagine standing at the finish line 6 months from now and the project is badly late. Then ask everyone to explain why, as if it had already happened. This forces people out of the optimistic story mode entirely, because you are no longer asking them to predict success. You are asking them to explain a failure that has, in their imagination, already occurred. People who will not volunteer a risk when asked directly what could go wrong will often produce a detailed, specific list of exactly what went wrong once you frame the exercise this way. Combine that list with the reference class number, and you get a timeline built from 2 independent angles instead of one hopeful guess. Then build in buffer before you promise a date to a client or your boss. Not because you are being pessimistic, but because the buffer is where the honest math actually lives. If similar projects have historically run well over their original estimate, and you have no specific reason to believe this one is structurally different, promising the original number is not optimism. It is a figure you already know. Statistically, you are unlikely to hit. Committing to it anyway is not confidence. It is borrowing credibility from your future self, who is going to have to explain the delay later using language that sounds a lot more defensive than we built in a buffer, because that is what the historical pattern actually showed. Here is a thought worth saying plainly, because it is the one implication in all of this that is not just recycled psychology, it is the actual management takeaway. Most organizations treat a missed deadline as a discipline problem. Someone did not push hard enough? Someone did not manage their time well? Someone needs more accountability next quarter? But if the planning fallacy is genuinely a structural bias sitting underneath nearly every human being who has ever made an estimate, and the evidence for that is about as strong as behavioral psychology gets, then punishing individuals for a planning fallacy-driven delay is punishing people for a bug in human cognition, not a failure of effort. The real lever is not motivating people to try harder to hit an unrealistic date they never should have committed to in the first place. It is fixing the estimate before it hardens into a promise. That is a forecasting problem, not a discipline problem. And treating it like a discipline problem just trains your team to get better at hiding slippage instead of getting better at forecasting it honestly. So here is where this leaves you. Your project timeline is probably wrong right now, today, whatever it says on the shared calendar in front of you. Not because anyone lied, but because every brain in that planning meeting pictured the finished product and skipped the 11-message thread, the sick teammate, and the client who changes their mind halfway through, because that is what brains do with plans. Every time, in every industry, whether the budget is $7 million or 7,000. The Sydney Opera House team was not careless. The Denver airport engineers were not careless. They were doing exactly what you are about to do on your next project, unless you stop and ask the boring question first. How long did this kind of thing actually take last time? Ask that before you promise the exciting number. And if breakdowns like this one are useful to you, hit subscribe. A new case study goes up every week,